Hello and welcome to this special program to mark the 2021 International Women's Day. I'm Gloria Umezuke. The COVID-19 pandemic has seen progress made in improving the rights of women pushed back. Aside from increased gender-based violence, the pandemic has widened the gap between men and women in several aspects of our social lives. In Nigeria, gender inequality is one of the driving forces of the HIV and AIDS epidemic, and COVID-19 has exacerbated the situation. Tonight, I'll be speaking to two distinguished ladies on the issue of gender inequality. The Executive Director of the Joint United Nations Programme on HIV and AIDS, Mrs. Winnie Byanyima, and the First Lady of Ekiti State, Irelu Bisi Fayemi. So I'll begin with the First Lady of Ekiti State. What are the obstacles? What are the structures of oppression? These stereotypes, these myths that really curb women's full potentials?
We live in deeply patriarchal societies which always find a way of ordering the lives of women and girls through the manipulation of culture, tradition, and religion. So we find a situation whereby throughout her life cycle, a woman is told that she has certain restrictions. There's a limit to what she can accomplish. There are limitations on her dreams, and everything she wants to aspire to has to be mediated by male-dominated forces, structures, and institutions in her life. And when I talk about patriarchal power and oppression, I'm talking not necessarily about individual men. I'm talking about the structures that come together to enforce this. Political structures, economic, technological, educational, religious, and so on. And so what we need to do is to interrogate all these structures and find a way of ensuring that there's a level playing field for women and girls. Because without that, we will continue to deal with symptoms. And almost every crisis that we have dealt with in the African women's movement is a symptom of this deep-rooted issue to do with patriarchal power and oppression and how this confines women into certain spaces, rendering them voiceless, as I said, throughout their life cycle.
These are issues that are very deep, and we've always tried to advance women's rights from different countries. Every country speaks about this. On days like this, we find advocacy, intensifying. When you talk about these inhibitions, are there deep challenges you really wish, you could unearth, to be able to advance even more the cause?
Yes, well, there are a whole range of issues. The list is definitely never exhaustive, but I'll start from the issue of women's voice, women's capacity to be able to make decisions and to be part of policy-making decisions, right from the community level to the national level. So the issue of women and political participation and governance is absolutely key. And if we take a country like Nigeria, the giant of Africa, where we have less than 5% of women in the National Assembly, and there are some state houses of assembly where we have no women at all. That does not augur well for women to be able to drive agendas for change for themselves and their communities. Following on from that, there's the issue of feminization of poverty. Women are always the one who have the least amount of resources to work with. And with the very little resources they have to use that to care for their children, for families, for their communities. So we need to address that, the issue of economic empowerment and livelihoods. And then, of course, there's the issue of access to education. We have so many girls now in our country who are vulnerable because they're out of school. There are at least 15 million Nigerian children who are out of school at the moment. And 16% of that figure are girls. And we all know what happens when girls are left roaming the streets. What do we think happens to them? They get pregnant. the children that they give birth to will also get pregnant at a young age, and then will perpetuate a cycle of generational poverty. So we need to address the issue of educating girls and ensuring that they become productive members of society. Then there's the issue of ending sexual and gender-based violence that we are very familiar with. We cannot be a country that condones violence as a way of life. We have laws in place, but we need to ensure that those laws are fully implemented so that we can move women who are victims into being survivors. And of course, there is the critical importance of ensuring that we create opportunities for a new generation of voices, to have opportunities for them to enter into decision-making spaces, for them to have employment opportunities and so on, because we cannot continue to have this youth bulge where we send our children to school, they leave school, they don't have any sense of employment, they don't have any opportunities for employment. And if they happen to be young women, that again contributes to their vulnerability. That creates a fertile ground for transactional relationships, which then makes them vulnerable to things like HIV/AIDS. The list is endless.
Now, we're not unfamiliar with all these issues, and the big question is how fast, how do we really hope to advance these things, in the short space of time, or if you call it short, how do we hope to, take bigger steps in addressing these issues? Executive Director, from your experience, tell us what lessons really that we can adopt from other countries to address these salient issues in Nigeria.
I first met BC. We were building the African Women's Movement. We are coming from a conference, a global conference, United Nations, where all the countries of the world had come together and made commitments to advance women's rights and achieve gender equality. And we were excited about building a movement of women and gender-sensitive men in Africa to push and achieve these commitments. And that's how I met BC. She was building a Pan-African program to build women's leadership. Now, at that time, and even now, we are a world that's facing, let me say, big crises. And patriarchy plays into them, is a driver of them, and we have to unlock them, we must fight patriarchy. One is spiraling out of control economic inequality. We have a few people who've captured the economy of the world in our countries and globally, who are maximizing for themselves while others are sinking in poverty. So this gross inequality is actually fed by patriarchy. Because when you look at the supply chains of these businesses that maximize for a few men at the top, they have women struggling at the bottom. Either they are women growing cotton like in Burkina Faso, or they are women in textile industries dying in hot factories in Bangladesh. There are women peeling shrimps in Malaysia or Indonesia. They are underpaid women with no rights, fired when they get pregnant. They are humiliated, they have no voice at work, and that's how super profits are made at the top. So there's huge inequality that keeps growing because of the oppression of women in business, in the economy. So you see patriarchy feeding inequality. Then we have the problem of climate change. The whole world is roasting, the planet is roasting, but as it roasts, who is suffering the most? It is a woman. It's a woman who has to find food for her family, find water which is scarce, find an income, run away from a flood, build a shelter when the home is lost. It is a woman facing the consequences of climate change. But what is driving climate change? It is a business model that maximizes for men. The world is not roasting out of nature. It's roasting because we exploit the earth. We burn it. We use a form of energy that is piling up carbon dioxide in the space. And that's benefiting a few, but crushing women. So you see that patriarchy is a system that is used to build an economy that's unjust to poor people, particularly women, and that is destroying our planet, further destroying the lives of women. And now the third crisis is this one, which has hit us. COVID. COVID is a health crisis turned into a social and economic crisis. Again, you see that. Who is having to take the burden? Who is going to own out there to fight and save lives? It's women health workers. It's nurses. It's community health workers. It's women being exposed to the dangers of this virus. Who is caring for families? Who is facing the violence in the family as men return home and are stuck in the home and they start abusing the very women that they live with? It's women. So again, you see, patriarchy plays into a health crisis and affects women differently. That's why BC and I and African women, we have been fighting patriarchy, but fighting as African women, because it plays differently. Here in our countries, we face a neocolonial state. Neocolonial states are exploited. We sell cotton, and then we buy fabric. We buy value. We sell raw material. That's already unfair. But when you put in the tariffs, it means that we lose even more and we end up being beggars. Our countries are begging rich countries, but our wealth is taken for a poor price. So the whole economy is against us. So for us African women, we've always fought patriarchy while understanding that the global economy is skewed against us, understanding that crises hit us hardest, understanding that our own states are built in a way that build on patriarchy and don't take us as equal. The investment in our health is low, the investment in our children is low, our children are not in school, jobs are not there for us, we work in the informal sector where we are not secure in the jobs. When a crisis hits, we are sent home with nothing. So we fight patriarchy, poverty, militarism, neocolonialism together. This is the movement we come from.
Let me just jump in. Having come this far, we've had these issues delineated at several conferences and all of that. Do you feel a sense of satisfaction? How much of it do you feel?
Yes, we've won some things. When we're coming out of Beijing, we insisted in Beijing at the 4th World Conference on Women. We said, you know what, this is not just about women's rights. This is about the rights of our children. The full cycle. We are disadvantaged from birth. From birth. We are denied education as little girls. So we never have a future equal to men's. So we insisted on having a critical area of the girl child in that Beijing platform for action, didn't we, BC?
Yes.
And to have it, it took African women. We are the ones who fought for it. And after getting it, we went and fought with the World Bank, we fought with all these institutions which were saying, it's not, you can't afford, you Africans, you're too poor, you can't afford primary education for all kids. We've insisted. And within another 10 years, most countries had rolled out free universal primary education, and the gap between boys and girls was closing. Today it is closed actually at the primary level. What is remaining is to close it at the secondary level. And that's another struggle.
Do you have facts to back this up? What country are you referring to?
Of course we do.
We do. What I'm telling you, in the last 25 years ago, they were just about 1/3 or less in some countries. Sometimes some countries had just 6-10% girls in primary school. Today, when you look at the numbers of kids coming out of primary school, it's equal. It's 50-50 in primary school. But when you go to the secondary level, you see that 2/3 of our children here in Africa boys and girls are not in secondary school. And when you look closer, you see that there are even fewer girls than boys in secondary school. Why? Because it's costs. If a parent has to choose between a boy and a girl, sadly, in a patriarchal home, they prefer to pay for a boy. So we have to move towards getting our governments to pay for all kids to be in secondary school. That's how we'll close the gap for all and have all, for boys and girls, and have all of them in school. And they must. How are we going to be part of a global knowledge economy with 2/3 of our children sitting at home looking after goats? It can't work. So this is the movement we've fought in. We've won some things. So we don't feel despondent. This violence she talks about is terrible. It hurts women and girls in so many ways, including the vulnerability to HIV. We find that if you can reduce violence against women, you reduce very much their risk of being infected by HIV. But the violence is tolerated in society. So that's an issue we are still fighting on since Beijing. And I don't know, maybe BC knows what should we do to end it.
On the issue of tolerance, I mean, we see a lot of incidences, especially in Nigeria, where gender-based violence could be tolerated in some states, and then, a lot of these issues go unattended to because of stigmatization. How do you think we're fighting this?
Well, it's one of the many fights that we've had to contend with over the years. As my sister Winnie has said, we have won some battles and others we are still struggling with. When I think back to roughly 25 years ago when we were just leaving Beijing, in the whole of the African continent, there was only one shelter for women.
Imagine.
And that was founded by the Musasa Project in Zimbabwe, if you remember. And it was a group of women, it was not set up by the government, drawing attention to the fact that there were women who were in distress because of one form of violence or the other. That was years ago. Now, across the continent, we have different resources led by governments as well as civil society to address this issue. Here in Nigeria, one of the good things that COVID-19 did for us was to drive the issue of sexual and gender-based violence to the front burner. It had already been there. It didn't start with COVID. It's not going to end with COVID, but at least...
Only foregrounded it.
We were able to draw a lot more attention to the fact that there is an unprecedented level of violence against women and girls. And all of us need to take responsibility for that. And that is why, for example, one of the many networks I'm involved in is with my colleagues who are other governors' wives. We came together and set up a pressure group known as Nigerian Governors' Wives Against Gender-Based Violence. And the first thing we did was to write a memo to our husbands, the governors, at the Nigeria Governors Forum, asking them to please declare a state of emergency on gender-based violence. When you declare a state of emergency on an issue, what you are doing is prioritizing that issue, pushing it to the front, and deploying all the required resources, financial resources, human resources, technical resources, as well as the full weight of the leadership behind it. And so after that, we have seen many states across the country now domesticating the Violence Against Persons Prohibition Act. We are seeing many civil society organizations being recognized for the hard work that they have been doing all on their own without support from the government or other partners. And we have seen more people come forward knowing that we will no longer tolerate a culture of stigmatization, shaming and blaming victims and so on. People can come forward, tell their truth, and they will get justice. Now, it is very difficult to address these issues, at community level, grassroots level, but the fact that we have the policy frameworks in place and the legal frameworks, and we have some sense that people know that there has to be something done around this. It's a long way from where we have come from, say, 10 years ago. So in terms of gender-based violence in Nigeria, what I believe needs to be happening now, in fact, ought to have happened yesterday, but I will take whatever wins I can get, is that state of emergency that the governors declared on gender-based violence has to be something that is taken on by other public institutions, by other key organs of government, by the business sector, by the academia, all the institutions, the National Assembly. What is their own understanding of a state of emergency on gender-based violence? The Inspector General of Police, what is his own understanding in terms of how that applies to the police force? Our service chiefs, what is their own understanding of it? The private sector, the same thing, the judiciary, and so on. And then for those of us who are working on these issues at state level, we are aware that it's one thing to raise these issues in terms of, having policies and frameworks in place. We have very little in place for the treatment, care, and protection of GBV survivors. If we don't have resources in place, like sexual assault referral centers, like shelters to keep women and children in distress, or support for women's economic empowerment so that they can reduce their vulnerability and be able to escape abusive situations, then we are not going to get very far. Then there's also the issue of community ownership. We need to engage communities, our traditional rulers, our religious leaders, other stakeholders in the community. They are the ones who can help drive change at that local level. We are familiar with cases whereby when people come forward with reports, they are sabotaged by other people from within the community. So we need to have a means of ensuring that there's buy-in at grassroots level and, all those other spaces.
Since you declared the state of emergency was declared, do you have any real-life example of how, this has worked in some people's lives?
Miss Gloria wants instant solutions like instant coffee.
Well, we can give you examples from now to keep. For starters, when the state of emergency was declared on June 10th, 2020, there were no more than maybe 13 states in Nigeria who had domesticated the VAP Act. Okay. As of today, there are 21 states in the country who have domesticated VAP. In my state, in Ekiti State, over the past 9 months or so, we have put in place a sexual assault referral center, a brand new center. We built it from scratch, which means that victims of sexual assault can be cared for immediately, and they can have the full range of services that they need: access to justice, access to psychosocial support, and from there they can be moved to our brand new state shelter, which we opened in November of last year, which can support up to 208 women and their children at a time. And from there, they can be moved on to our vocational training center, which is a part of the shelter. And we also have a GBV Survivors Fund as well, which enables us give support to victims of GBV, for them, as I keep saying, to move from being victims to survivors. And I'm sure you're familiar with the Sex Offenders Register and the fact that all states who have ratified, who have domesticated the VAP Act, have to also have a Sex Offenders Register. In Ekiti, we've even gone a step further to put in place a name and shame policy, which means if there's anyone who is, indicted for a sexual offense, his photograph gets put up there as a sex offender and posted on walls in his community and all over the place. That serves as a strong deterrent. Not to mention the hundreds of women in my state who now know that if they need help with these issues, there will be someone to listen to them. There are institutions and structures in place to ensure that whatever shaming or stigmatization they might be facing in their communities will be dealt with, because we are there to support them every step of the way. That, for me, is the meaning of having a state of emergency. But we need to do more, because this is one state, and we have 36 states in the country, and we have cases of GBV coming forth every day, and some of us are impatient. Like you, I'm impatient. We cannot afford to wait on platitudes and rhetoric. The time is now. I know you're itching to come in. Just a moment. Yeah, that sounds fantastic, actually. How many people are in that shelter? I'm not allowed to give you the number of people in the shelter, but the shelter has the capacity to take 208 women at a time. Okay. Thank you.
Can I come in on this point? You see, the issue of violence against women and girls cuts on so many fronts. So many things that we want to achieve towards equality are undermined by violence against women and girls. So we fight it because it's bad in its own as violence against women, but it also undermines health, undermines education, undermines employment, undermines women's agency and participation in decision making. So we fight it for many reasons. And when we fight it, as we've always done, we fight it on the side of prevention and on the side of response. On the side of response, we want laws. And I congratulate so much BC for the leadership she's giving to push towards policy change. These policies that have come in place in a number of states is the starting point. You need the laws, you need the policies. You need to take them to implementation. Taking them to implementation means money. Finding the money to put in clinics, to put in police stations, law and order, to put in judiciaries and all that. That is a fight. But women have been working on this for years. By deploying tools, new tools like gender budgeting, they try to direct resources to the needs of women. So you put in all the feminist tools for driving resources towards the services, the shelters, the courts, the training of police and all that. But the real battles that are yet to be fought and won are the informal laws. These are the attitudes of people in the society. Why I'm bringing this in is that unless people don't tolerate, don't accept, and girls themselves and women also don't accept violence as it's okay, he loves me, or it's okay, I cannot talk about it, I cannot hide I can't tell what has happened in my family because I will look bad out there. Unless we can change the mindset of people, all the work on the response side is not useful. So this is where the big battles are, the informal laws that make it acceptable to violate a woman or a girl. We have a lot of work.
That's very crucial. I mean, we're still here talking about the International Women's Day, and we'll just take a few minutes. We'll be right back to share more on these reflections. Please join us again. Welcome back. We're still on to a special program to commemorate the 2021 International Women's Day celebration. And I still have with me two distinguished ladies, the Executive Director of the United Nations Joint Program on HIV and AIDS, UNAIDS, and the First Lady of Ekiti State, Erelu BC Fayemi. Thank you so much for staying on the program. We left off with the state of emergency and how, VAP came on board and we're trying to advance all of this. But what exactly, where do we have support structures really to help the girl child? Do you think they're really, solid support structures, in your opinion? I think, as my sister Winnie said earlier, those of us who were involved in the struggles to get the issue of the girl child onto the Beijing Platform for Action in 1995, we felt after a couple of years, we felt that that case had been made and that it had been won. And if you look at a country like Nigeria, when it comes to enrollment at primary school level, for example, even secondary schools, many states in southern Nigeria, you have instances where the enrollment of girls actually outnumbers that of boys. If you attend the graduation ceremonies of a lot of universities, you see girls distinguishing themselves, even in the sciences, science, mathematics, engineering, and so on. And so that points to the fact that there has been a lot of movement over the past 25 years. But because of a whole range of reasons, insurgencies, violent conflict, poverty, and a whole lot of other things, we find ourselves in a situation whereby girls who do get to go to school, we are having difficulties keeping them in school. They're exposed to a whole range of exploitation and abuse. And so we find so many of our girls dropping out of school because they are pregnant. And if you're from a poor family and you drop out of school, that's the end of your life as you know it. So that's why we are saying the structures that we need to have in place to support girl child education need to include free and compulsory education at primary levels and, if possible, secondary as well. Second, we need to address the issue of the security and safety of our girls in schools. School premises should be secured. There should be adequate fencing and lighting. We should not have a situation where our girls keep being abducted from their schools as if they are goats or chickens, headed into wagons and driven off into the dead of the night. How can that be? We also need to have due diligence in place to ensure that those responsible for teaching our girls in school are not people who are predators, who have been teaching in Benin and impregnated a girl in Benin and then got away with a slap on the wrist. And mind you, the girl got pregnant and that's the end of her life as she knows it. The teacher, the only thing that happens to him, as Sister Winnie shared the story earlier today at the session we are on, it's the same all over. The teacher gets off with a slap on the wrist, gets another job in Port Harcourt, and he does the same thing there. There is no tracking. So we need sex offenders registers. We need due diligence so that people who are responsible for violating our girls can be tracked and justice is done. We also need to do more advocacy with parents, with teachers, with communities, for them to understand the need for us to instill self-esteem and confidence in our girls, to remove all the obstacles in their way. If a girl comes back from school in the afternoon while her brother is doing his homework, she is the one who now has to start doing all the housework, or you then put a tray of oranges on her head for her to go and hawk. As she's hawking the oranges, that's where she falls into the hands of a predator, and then we start having to deal with an unwanted pregnancy. So communities need to understand that they have a role to play in being part of those structures and systems that make the education of our girls viable. And then, as we create opportunities for the education of girls, we should also ensure that the boys who they are studying with, or the boys they are going to be competing with for, higher education, for jobs and so on, are also receiving some instruction in terms of what it means to be a man, in terms of what masculinity really means, in terms of what consent means, in terms of what respect means. So we don't educate and raise these girls only for them to fall into the hands of lazy, entitled men. So we need to change the way we socialize our boys and our girls. Those are part of the structures that we need to educate our girls and make them productive throughout their lives.
Do you get a sense that you're speaking in maybe futility when it comes to women in politics? Because we look at the asymmetrical distribution of women, in the political cadres, and you're wondering, we have been talking about this over and over again. Who's listening? Who's doing something? Is the government talking? Is the government doing anything?
Well, as we have said earlier, those are some of the manifestations of patriarchy. The way patriarchal power works, it's to do with male dominance, it's to do with how structures operate, And none of these structures will willingly cede power or hand over power. So that power needs to be questioned, it needs to be interrogated, and where we have the opportunity, it needs to be seized. You talk about women and political participation. It's a familiar story. We keep saying the same thing over and over. Women are the ones who fuel political machineries. Women are the ones who do all the hard work, the dirty work. But when it comes to giving out positions, that's when you remember that woman, she's rude. That woman, she doesn't have a husband. So what women need to do, regardless of their political affiliation, is to make it expensive for our political leaders to ignore women. We need to go.
What do you mean?
We need to go out there and register to be able to vote. We need to have our voters' cards, because there's no point staying on Facebook, on Instagram and Twitter and making a whole lot of noise about how bad leadership is, how bad governance is. There are no votes on Facebook, no matter how engaging or entertaining the space is. So we need to go out there and register as voters. And if we are interested in the issue of contestation around power, we need to join political parties. Because right now, unless our constitution is revised or amended, and you can make provision for independent, candidates. Right now, the only viable, channel you have to political office is via a political party. So people need to go and join political parties. Whatever party people choose to join is entirely up to them. I always advise women to stop joining fringe parties. Join a mainstream political party if they are serious about political power. A fringe party will give you visibility. It will give you an opportunity to to express yourself, for you to state an agenda in terms of how you do things differently. So that's absolutely fine, but it will not necessarily give you power. So join one of the mainstream parties. Let your voices be heard. With the political parties that exist, most of the party offices are held by men. The men are the ones who are the chairs, they are the vice chairs, they are the secretaries, they are the legal advisors, and that is where political power lies. And women, we have to make do with being either the woman leader or the welfare officer. Let women go and take control of these political parties. Let the women's wings of these parties be movements. Just like we have the ANC Women's League in South Africa, let them be movements who can actually dictate terms in terms of, what women need to see politically. We also need to engage the energies and the voices of young people. We saw what happened with the NSAS movement and the critical role young women in particular played. That agency is there, that energy is there. So we need to tap into that and try and see if there is going to be a shift in terms of the kinds of faces and the agency we need in terms of the governance of this country.
Ms. Winnie, how often do you feel discouraged, especially when we come on with topics like this, women in politics, and how there's an unfair distribution of women at the top there in the political or even socioeconomic aspects of life? And then you look at it's even worse in low and middle income countries where women's participation in politics is even lower, the rating is lower. I mean, what do you think we should be doing in this aspect?
The country that today has the highest participation of women across, not just in political leadership, but in leadership across, in the public service, in the local government, is Rwanda, a post-conflict country, low income. And you also find that countries like Mozambique, very poor, countries like Tanzania have a higher participation of women in politics than the UK, the oldest democracy in the world and the 6th richest country in the world. So it's not correlated with wealth. In fact, we see that countries that are emerging from crisis often have the space to recreate their political structure and political system and include women more, and include youth, and include people with disabilities and so on. So the lesson here is that as BC was saying, that you need to have everyone represented in a democracy. Here in Africa, our democracies are new. Remember that. Remember that we came from 400 years of slavery. We were being sold for 400 years. Then there was 100 years of colonialism. We were dominated by Europe. And then we got nominal independence just around 1960. So many of our countries are about 60 years in democracy. This means we are building something new, but we are building it in the form of to look like what our colonialists left, right? So we have a challenge. And I see the solution lies in working with young people. We have to get young people to demand more and to scrutinize more political leadership. Both boys and girls, men and women. I have yet to see a leader on this continent who comes to the African Union or goes anywhere in the media and says, you know what, since I came to power, this is my second year, I've created so many jobs. Have you heard anybody giving us a track record of how many jobs they've created? I'd like to see a leader who says that, you know what, I've been in power 3 years, all my girls are in school. I took the numbers from this to this. To mention achievements for their people. I don't hear it. And why? Because our people are not connected to the democracy. They are silent. They don't demand accountability. So we want to, when I retire, that's where I'm going, to work with young people, to make a scorecard and tell the president every month that, Mr. President, this month you created no jobs. We want to see jobs. Mr. President, the girls are still out there, not in classrooms. This year has passed. How many will you put in the classroom next year? This is what makes a democracy. Citizens who are assertive, citizens who demand, and that's why movement building for women for us is important. Some are moving faster towards creating real democracy. Look at Ghana next door. People in my country were making jokes, cynical jokes about Ghana. They were saying, what's wrong with these Ghanaians? Why are we not hearing bullets and grenades and for us here elections are loud? Because it's now peaceful transfer of power, they vote, somebody loses, somebody wins, and there's a parliament, it debates issues, but they also don't have many women.
Let me get into your inner thoughts. Do you sometimes sit and give yourself a timeline or give African countries a timeline and say, at so time, so year, we will see African women, begin to, spread out in the political sphere, in their numbers?
For us, we had that vision. I keep talking about BC and I in the women's movement. When we were coming out of Beijing, we had an agenda to build institutions for women because we knew that this whole thing about building women's power and in all institutions meant that women must have their space from which they can launch their agenda. So I met BC when she was building something called African Women's Leadership Institute. From there, she even said, this is not even enough. I'm going to set up a foundation to fund women's organizations. And we said, BC, you're crazy. Where will you get the money from to be a funder? She said, you wait. She created it. African Women's Development Foundation was now funding women's organizations to have their own agenda and demand. Because when you're funded by a Muzungu, you know what Muzungu means? Muzungu in Swahili means a white, a white organization. If you are funded externally, the external donor also has their interest. We will make it when we build our own space as women, defend that space, and from that space, be uncompromising about our interests. And that's what we will leave some of us, that we've built certain institutions that are still there for women to use to take forward these struggles. They are not one generation, they are battles over several generations.
I really appreciate that. Unfortunately, we've run out of time, but we have a minute for each of you for your concluding reflections.
Well, I want to speak to the issue of space and voice for women. Around the time of the Beijing conference, I was a young woman in my early 30s. And with other young women, we were thinking about what 20, 25 years would look like for us down the line. We were thinking about what capacities and competencies we would need to be leaders on the continent. And that's how the African Women's Leadership Institute was conceptualized. And that's how I met my sister Winnie when we went to Uganda to set up the office. I was based in London at the time. And Winnie was like a big sister to us, a mentor, and she too had, was very prominent in the Ugandan women's movement then. From the African Women's Leadership Institute, we were able to figure out that African women needed access. For them to be able to own their spaces and their voices, they needed access to resources that were not tied to resources of international development partners. And that's how the African Women's Development Fund came to be. And the African Women's Fund has been in existence now for over 20 years. It was set up by three of us, myself, Dr. Hilda Tadria, who is from Uganda, and Joanna Foster from Ghana, who sadly passed away a few years ago. So I had to relocate from London to Accra to run the African Women's Development Fund, which meant me living in Ghana for 10 years. And from there, I moved back to Nigeria, where my husband became governor. So over the past 20 years, the African Women's Development Fund has provided financial support to over 3,000 women's organizations in at least 42 African countries, and we're giving out millions of dollars. And from that space, I moved to where I am today. And I see this, including funding HIV/AIDS, exactly.
Beautiful.
Now, the space I'm in today is a space I'm only going to occupy for a period of time. But I have learned, because of all those spaces I've occupied before and the kind of voice that it gave me, that this space is useful to be able to have a unique kind of voice, to be able to use it in ways which I would not be able to, if I was not in that space. And after I'm done, another person will come on board. And that's why I think it's important that wherever we are, whoever we are, let us think of what tomorrow looks like.
Thank you very much. Fantastic. Let's have your conclusion.
To say the same, that there's power in organizing, that we only have democracies that are as good as we are, the citizens. If we know what we want, can organize around what we want, demand for what we want, our leaders will deliver it. They set out to deliver it, but they found themselves in complexity with lacking structures of accountability, and they end up not doing it. So we have to be as good as the leaders we want. And with women's rights, their right to health, their right to education, their right to equal opportunity in the market, in the economy, all these are political issues. I'm here, I've come to meet your government leaders, to meet civil society, first of all to praise them for having fought in the last 7-8 years and really moved forward in reducing the number of new infections of HIV and putting many, many people on treatment, those who are positive, so they can live long and healthy lives. But I've also come to wake them up to the fact that HIV has a woman's face in this country, a young woman's face. That there is now need to work hard to help women and young girls avoid getting infected with HIV, and that's also possible. It's a next battle. But Nigeria is a country that, if it turns this around completely, we will have won like 1/3 of the battle in this continent, just because of the sheer numbers of people you have.
On a day like this, commemorating International Women's Day, we've been talking about how the advancing of gender inequality will halt stereotypes, and of course advance the rights of women. Thank you for joining us on this special program commemorating the International Day of Women 2021. We'll see you again. I'm Gloria Omezuke.